good to see everybody back here tonight. We are going to continue in Ezekiel chapter 40. Ezekiel 40, 41, and 42 describe the temple in Jerusalem during the millennial kingdom. Most of the time people try to tackle all of these together all at once. I am not going to do that, however. By the time I got done with chapter 40, I think I used roughly 73 slides that we might make through tonight, we might not. There's 48, 49 verses in chapter 40, so that's enough in itself to keep us here for an hour and to go through, if not longer than that. A lot of these measurements is just that. It's measurements as Ezekiel's looking at the temple, what's going on here. And so I want us to look at these here for a little bit tonight and get an idea of what's going on and how big this is. It's not something just small or minute. How big this temple compound is going to be. The size of it and it all plays a part in what God is showing Ezekiel here. So I want to share that with you. Last week we studied the reason that there is a temple in the kingdom. And we looked a little bit at the temple itself. And tonight we begin to start our tour of the temple. But before we do that, let's look back at what we've seen last week. And I need you to prepare you for a little of what we do tonight. Remember, we're looking at the period of history between this age and the new heavens and the new earth to be created in the future. The kingdom is a 1,000-year period that ends this age. For that, Ezekiel tells Israel that they will have a new and better temple. And we go back to the question we had last week of why is there a temple, and there were three reasons. First, sin always requires a spiritual sacrifice and a physical sacrifice. The spiritual sacrifice comes from God in the form of Jesus Christ, who died spiritually in our place on the cross. And our physical sacrifice takes place on earth in the presence of God. Our spiritual sacrifice of Christ happened once in a certain moment of history, and it suffices for all saints of all time. Before and after that moment, believers place faith in that historic act done on their behalf. Through our faith in Jesus' sacrifice, God credits us with Christ's righteousness. We receive a spiritual covering for our sin, which reconciles us to God, and in addition to that one-time spiritual sacrifice, the saints have always engaged in a physical sacrifice as well. So we talked about that last week. We continue to end the physical sacrifice even now. Even though we're not bringing bulls and lambs and doves into the temple, we have to sacrifice ourselves. Our physical sacrifices happen repeatedly throughout our lifetime for as long as we possess sin. The physical sacrifices must be done in the presence of the Lord so that they may be sanctified, and their purpose was twofold. They reconcile us with the community of God's people by making sacrifices in His presence. We're acknowledging our sin, repentance, and we're making personal sacrifice to reconcile us with our brothers and sisters before God, just as Jesus taught in the book of Matthew. I mentioned this last week. Matthew chapter number 5, verse 23 says, "Therefore, if you bring thy gift to the altar, and thou rememberest that thy brother hath an ought against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way, and be reconciled to thy brother, then come and offer thy gift." Jesus is making the point that the primary purpose in bringing offerings to the temple was to reconcile with God's people. Coming before God's presence without true repentance defies the purpose of the sacrifice. What good is an offering if we're not sorry for what we've done? What good is it? Oh, well, I'm doing this and I've brought all these. I mean, take it back to the Old Testament times and even the time of Jesus. I brought all these lambs, these doves, these bulls, all this to sacrifice, but I'm not sorry for anything I've done. You're sacrificing them in vain. And I'll just go ahead and say the same thing happens in our life, that when I'm going to make these sacrifices, but I'm not sorry for anything that I've done. You're doing it in vain. You're not truly repentant of what you've done and what's going on in your life, and you need to be repentant of those things in order to have that right relationship with God and that right relationship with one another. You see, we can come before God's presence without true repentance defies its purpose. In a simple sense, we can compare it to going to a judge to pay your traffic fine. It puts you back in good standing with society and the law for a time. But in order for this to be true, we must perform these sacrifices in the presence of God. In the same way that you can't pay your traffic fine to the policeman who tickets you, nor can you give the money to your neighbor and consider your fine paid, you must go before the judge, admit to your crime, and pay your fine there. That's how physical sacrifices work. They bring us back into good standing with the community of God's people. Secondly, physical sacrifices teach us about the spiritual sacrifice of Christ. The very idea that blood must be spilled to pay our price for sin is demonstrated in the reality of Christ on the cross once for all time. Our minimal sacrifices of time or money or property can't compare to the perfect life given on our behalf. And the fact that our sacrifices are repeated routinely reminds us that we need a solution for our sin that is greater than our own efforts can provide. It's greater than what you and I can do. No matter how good I am, I could never get into heaven on my own, folks. No matter how much self I sacrifice and put out of the way, I could not do it. So the physical sacrificial system is a daily reminder of the great spiritual sacrifice of Christ that we can't see. And so it's easy to see the process working in the Old Testament times when Israel had the law and the temple, and we're learning that this process also exists in the millennial temple when Israel is again as a nation and the temple returns. So where was it during the church age, and did it exist, and how do we perform them? We talked about this last week. Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 told us that we are to sacrifice ourselves daily. The book of Romans chapter 12 through 16 shows us a list of things that we should be doing to sacrifice. And we know that God is dwelling among the Gentiles in this age, and while Israel is under judgment for a time. But there are multiple Gentile nations, so the Lord hasn't set up His temple in just one Gentile nation. It would make it appear that He was selecting one above all the rest. Only Israel has a special status among all the nations. Why? Because they're God's chosen people, and they have been from the very beginning, ladies and gentlemen. It was not they beat everybody out and, they were the ones on top. They were the ones God chose. So instead, the Lord has set up His residence in every believer individually so that the Lord is equally present in every nation. And this is a special dispensation for this age, made necessary by Israel's scattering and lack of physical temple on earth. And therefore, our physical sacrifices must be made in person, in our person, the temple of God, where God dwells. And Paul explains the acts of self-sacrifice. We talked about them. And in a sense, we can say that the commands Paul gives in Romans 12 through 16 constitute a New Testament sacrificial system. There are acts of love that restore us in fellowship with our fellow believers and direct us away from sinning in the future. And of course, our system also teaches us about Christ. His ultimate sacrifice meant giving His life for us, and we boast about sacrifices that by making our life a living sacrifice for Him. So no matter when in history a saint lives, there's always need for a spiritual sacrifice and a physical sacrifice for sin. And the kingdom age will be no different. We talked about this, that sin will still be present during this time. The citizens who sin in that age will engage in physical sacrifice before the Lord. And so we know that because Israel has returned to glory and regathered her land, the Lord's presence will now be located only there. When Jesus comes back and the millennial kingdom is built, where is Jesus going to reside? He's going to reside in the temple there in the midst of that place. And so the physical sacrifice must be made once again. It's a very large description that we find, and so I've got some pictures to try to help the best of what I could find to help us look at some things so that we can get an idea of what's what. Folks, I may be off on numbers. Please bear with me. As I told you last week, none of us, when we go by a tape measure today, it's not in cubits and hands. It's in feet and inches or in the metric system. And a lot of those things have been changed down through the years of how they use those. So we're going to do it to the best of our ability to try to give you some accurate measurements of what these will look like. And we'll look at some of these things going on. As I said, chapter 40 is the temple walls, the gates, and the courts, and that's all we're going to cover tonight. So we're going to start here in verse number 1 of Ezekiel chapter 40. And Ezekiel says, in the 25th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year, after that the city was smitten. In the selfsame day the hand of the Lord was upon me, and brought me thither. In the visions of God brought he me into the land of Israel, and set me upon a very high mountain, by which was as the frame of a city on the south. And he brought me thither, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of brass, with a line of flax in his hand, and a measuring reed, and he stood in the gate. And he said unto me, Son of man, behold thine eyes, and hear with thine ears, and set thine heart upon all that I shall show thee. For to the intent that I might show them unto thee art thou brought hither. Declare all that thou seest to the house of Israel. And behold, a wall on the outside of the house round about, and in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits long, 6 cubits long by the cubit, and a hand breadth. And so he measured the breadth of the building 1 reed, and the height 1 reed. Now, does anybody know how long a cubit is? Nope. So a cubit is roughly 18 inches. But this here says a cubit in the span of a man's hand. So it could be anywhere from 18 to 27 inches. A lot of biblical scholars mark this out and say that it's 2 feet. But then some of the math doesn't add up later on. So 18 inches is roughly. There will be some areas that you may hear me change it a little bit and say that it's 2. But just bear with me. That's roughly what it is. Because a cubit is normally from the elbow to the fingertips. That's what they're saying. So we see a high mountain. I don't know how well this is working up there. Okay. There's a high mountain dominates the landscape of Israel in that day, and it'll rise up from a plain, as Ezekiel or Zechariah 14 describes. It will be the highest mountain on earth, and Ezekiel is met by a tour guide with a measuring rod and a flax and a line in his hand. These were instruments of measuring. We don't know who this man is that Ezekiel met, whether it's an angel, whether it's pre-incarnate Christ. If you want to debate that, we can do that some other time. I don't know who was there. We know what the Bible says, that he was met with by man. And that's the extent of what I'm going to do with it. I know God can do wonderful things and marvelous things, and so there's a reason that Ezekiel was met with this man, and he uses these things to measure the temple's outermost walls. And the angel measures with a long cubit, which is almost 2 feet in length, and we can get a good idea of the distance by multiplying cubits by 2. So this law wall running around the perimeter is a temple compound. So we've got some pictures here that show us. This is what one rendition shows of the millennial temple, of what it might look like. Somebody's idea of it. Here's some other ones like that as well. Folks, I truly believe that it'll be beyond anything we can even begin to think or imagine. Even though we have these measurements, I don't even begin to think that it's entering into our minds the capacity of what God is doing here in this. And then this low wall that's running around the outside, it's just sort of a barrier top wall. So we pick up back in verse number 6, and it says, And then he came unto the gate which looketh toward the east, and went up the stairs thereof, and measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad, and the other threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad. And every little chamber was 1 reed long, and 1 reed broad. And between the chambers were 5 cubits, and the threshold of the gate by the porch of the gate within was 1 reed. He measured also the porch of the gate within 1 reed. Then measured he the porch of the gate 8 cubits, and the post thereof 2 cubits, and the porch of the gate was inward. And the little chambers of the gate eastward were 3 on this side and 3 on that side. They three were of one measure, and the post had one measure on this side and on that side. And he measured the breadth of the entry gate 10 cubits, and the length of the gate 13 cubits. The space also before the little chambers was 1 cubit on this side, and the space was 1 cubit on that side, and the little chambers were 6 cubits on this side and 6 cubits on that side. Like I said, there's a lot of measurement, and somebody already tonight said that's the reason why they made a calculator, right? So we've got some pictures here that they're showing what these could look like, these little rooms. This man enters the complex from the east and ascends, as we'll find out in just a little bit, the 7 stairs into a large opening into the next wall called a gate. He there starts the dimensions of this multi-chambered gate, and included are guard rooms on both sides, which are roughly about 10 by 10 in size. That'll give you some idea of what's what. And it begins to show us about these guard rooms here. The back side of the gate leading to the outer court has a porch held up by pillars. So you enter through a large gate that leads you to an outer courtyard. And it's outer in the sense that there's a second inner wall around the temple building itself, but it's inside the first wall and gates. So there's layer upon layer as we go through these. 6, 9, yep, that's the other one. So the post and the gates as well. There's some interesting things here in just a minute, and I'll try to bring them back up in just a moment. As we go through this next measurements in 40:13 here, and it says, and he measured then the gate from the roof of one little chamber to the roof of another. The breadth was 25 cubits, door against door. And he made also posts of 60 cubits, even unto the post of the court round about the gate. And from the face of the gate of the entrance unto the face of the porch of the inner gate were 50 cubits. And there were narrow windows to the little chambers, and to their post within the gate round about, and likewise to the arches, and windows were round about inward, and upon each post were palm trees. So he's given more measurements and showing this, and I wish there was a way we could show the little post-like dividers in between all of those there of how they were separated. I have another picture here, and I don't know how much it's going to show up, but it gives us an idea of the spacing in between each and every one of those, the 5 cubits, the 6, all along the way. And when we have the dimensions of this gate, they estimate it to be roughly between 100 feet long, 50 feet wide, and it has a door of roughly 100 feet, and a porch of 120 feet. That's a large area. And if you want to know how large, if I remember correctly, this building, not counting the porch, is 120 feet long from end to end, correct? It's 40 feet this way and 120 feet from the back to the porch. So that shows you how big this opening is going to be in this place. It's a large space, and we notice that in the measurements, the recurring numbers of 5 and 6 and things like that, 5 cubits, or you find 5 cubits and 20 cubits, things like that. And it's interesting that we find these here, because does anybody know what those numbers mean in the Bible? 5 and 6. All right, well, let me give you what number 6 is first then. 6 is the number for sinful man. 5 is the number for grace. So the number 5 is the number for grace, while 6 is the number for sinful man. So symbolically, this gate reminds the people that this is a place where sin meets grace. The spaces of sin, 6 cubits, where people congregate, are divided and broken up by the walls of grace, which are 5 cubits. Once again, God is showing His grace to humanity through what He's doing. And the symbolic sense is that sin will be broken here. Finally, the guard rooms have shuttered or thin gaps to see in all directions. And the outside of the gate is part of a covered porch running along the inside of the perimeter wall. Posts holding up the porch are decorated with palm trees so that the gates can be easily spotted along the wall. I mean, if it all looked the same from the outside, where would you know where the gate was at? With it all looking similar and going through there, so we notice that as we go through these gates, we notice that all of them are designated by these palm branches. But a palm branch in itself is a sign of what? Peace. So we can see these things throughout this chapter. So we pick up again in verse 17. And it says, "Then brought he me into the outward court, and lo, there were chambers, and a pavement made for the court round about. 30 chambers were upon the pavement. And the pavement by the side of the gates over against the length of the gates was the lower pavement. Then he measured the breadth from the forefront of the lower gate unto the forefront of the inner court without 100 cubits eastward and northward." So once again, we have some of these similar pictures. I don't know why I put them in the same spot. This outer court rings the temple building proper, and along the inner side of the outer wall are 30 chambers, which seems to limit to three of the 4 walls. And they may serve as meeting areas like Solomon's porch did in the second temple. The span between the outer and inner wall is roughly 200 feet. Then the gates on the north and south wall are also measured. In verse 20, the gate of the outward court that looked toward the north, he measured the length thereof and the breadth thereof. And the little chambers thereof were 3 on this side and 3 on that side, and the posts thereof and the arches thereof were after the measure of the first gate. The length thereof was 50 cubits, the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And their windows and their arches and their palm trees were after the measure of the gate that looketh toward the east, and they went up unto it by 7 steps, and the arches thereof were before them. And the gate of the inner court was over against the gate toward the north and toward the east, and he measured from gate to gate 100 cubits. After that he brought me toward the south, and behold, a gate toward the south. He measured the posts thereof and the arches thereof according to these measures. And there were windows in it and arches thereof round about, like those windows. The length was 50 cubits, the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And there were 7 steps to go up to it, and the arches thereof were before them. And it had palm trees, one on this side and another on that side upon the posts thereof. And there was a gate in the inner court toward the south, and he measured the gate from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. So we have an image here that these gates are identical to the east. One thing that I've noticed in this is there's no gate on the west side that is being described so far. So we have gates to the east, gates to the north, and gates to the south, but we don't see any gates described to the east, or to the west, excuse me. And then the next thing we're going to find is Ezekiel begins to describe the inner court of what it looks like. And we can go back through these in a little bit. I'm sure somebody's going to have some questions as we go through these. It says, "And he brought me to the inner court by the south gate, and he measured the south gate according to these measures. And the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, according to these measures. And there were windows in it, and the arches thereof round about, and it was 50 cubits long, and 5 and 20 cubits broad. And the arches round about were 5 and 20 cubits long, and 5 cubits broad. And the arches the arches thereof were toward the utter court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof, and the going up to it had 8 steps. And he brought me into the inner court toward the east, and he measured the gate according to these measures. And the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof were according to these measures, and there were windows therein, and in the arches thereof round about, it was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits broad. And the arches thereof were toward the outer court, and the palm trees were upon the posts thereof on this side and on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. And he brought me to the north gate and measured it according to these measures. The little chambers thereof, the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, and the windows to it round about, the length was 50 cubits, and the breadth 25 cubits. And the posts thereof were toward the utter court, and the palm trees and were upon the posts thereof on this side and on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. And the chambers and the entries thereof were by the posts of the gates, where they washed the burnt offering. And in the porch of the gate were 2 tables on this side and 2 tables on that side, to slay thereon the burnt offering and the sin offering and the trespass offering. And at the side without, as one goeth up to the entry of the north gate, were 2 tables, and on the other side, which was at the porch of the gate, were 2 tables. 4 tables were on this side, 4 tables on that side. By the side of the gate, 8 tables, whereupon they slew their sacrifices. And the 4 tables were of hewn stone for the burnt offering, of 1.5 cubits long, and 1.5 cubits broad, and 1 cubit high. Whereupon also they laid the instruments wherewith they slew the burnt offering and sacrifice. And within were hooks and a hand broad fastened round about. Upon the tables was the flesh of the offering. And without the inner gate were the chambers of the singers in the inner court, which was at the side of the north gate, and their prospect was toward the south, one at the side of the east gate, having the prospect toward the north. And he said unto me, this chamber, whose prospect is toward the south, is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the house. And the chamber whose prospect is toward the north is for the priests, the keepers of the charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, among the sons of Levi, which come near to the Lord to minister unto him. So he measured the court 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, 4 square, and the altar that was before the house. So once again, we have these measurements. These gates are the same as the outer gates in design dimensions, though mirrored to the ones on the outer wall. They have 8 steps and not 7. And again, there were 3 of these inner gates leading through the inner wall on the north, east, and south sides of the wall. And the only difference between the inner gates and outer gates is that the steps they have 8 steps instead of 7. Does anybody know what the number 8 means? No. Number 8 means new beginnings. So this is where man gets a new beginning with God. Ain't it amazing how God does things and works things out? And so inside the temple, the worshipers will find a new beginning with God. And we see next, we've seen the rooms preparing the sacrifices, 2 chambers by the doorway were used to rinse the animals before the sacrifices, 4 tables on the outside of the inner gates, 4 on the inside of the inner gates, a total of 8 tables. They were used for sacrificing the animals. There were also 4 tables to hold the slaughtering implements. Similar dressing tables have been found in ancient temples. Next, there were spaces in the inner court for singers and priests who led the worship during the functions of the temple. The priests were descendants of the son of Zadok. He was a faithful priest who stayed loyal to David and later to Solomon. His sons in the kingdom will be priests in the temple. And that's a reminder that faithfulness now has a reward in the kingdom in the form of service to Christ. Finally, Ezekiel gives us dimensions of the inner court, and it's a square 200 feet on each side with an altar standing in front of the temple building itself. Once again, we can see part of that, the inner court, by the cubits and measurements. And then we look at the last two, and then I'm going to let y'all go because I know this is a lot of things to try to wrap all together tonight, because it has been a lot in my mind trying to go through these and measure all of these. Verse 48, it says, "And he brought me to the porch of the house and measured each post of the porch, 5 cubits on this side, 5 cubits on that side. And the breadth of the gate was 3 cubits on this side and 3 cubits on that side. The length of the porch was 20 cubits and the breadth 11 cubits. And he brought me by the steps whereby they went up to it, and there were pillars by the post, one on this side and one on that side." So once again, here is another picture of that gate and that measurement there of those posts going into the inner court. Now, as I said, there is a lot of measurements in these, a lot of numbers. People say, well, numbers are not important in the Bible. I truly think they are. I don't think God does anything by chance or by circumstance, ladies and gentlemen. God has a plan and a purpose for everything that's in His Word, so that you and I can use it to further our understanding of what He is doing and what He's doing, not only for the nation of Israel here, but for the nation of Israel later on and for us later on. You need to remember, too, that these people were getting this message after Nebuchadnezzar had flattened their temple. All of this is coming, and Ezekiel is prophesying that, hey, this is going to take place, and Nebuchadnezzar has just got done destroying everything in Jerusalem. There is no temple, there is no walls, there is nothing. The foundations is about all that's left. He has destroyed it all down, and God's saying, look, I'm going to rebuild. At a later point in time, I'm going to rebuild and restore this relationship, and this is what is going to take place in this period when I reestablish the nation of Israel as a nation, as they are supposed to be. These things will take place and transpire. So we see this as we've come through here, and I know that we've covered these 48 verses, 49 verses, rather quickly. It helps if I put my glasses on every once in a while. It does help somewhat. But I know that there's going to be some questions about these measurements and the size and stuff, so I wanted to leave enough time tonight for us to do those and maybe not keep everybody here till midnight. This way we can look at it, and little by little next week we'll try to cover chapter 41, and then we'll try to cover chapter 42 and get through all of these measurements and the size of this building to try to get something out to scale so you can get an idea of how big this place truly is going to be. So with that being said, Mr. Bruce, we will